Story recapped here. Today, I'm going to show a 2009 horror, mystery, and thriller film called Case 39. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. Emily Jenkins is an optimistic and passionate social worker living in Oregon. Because of her damaged past, Emily feels it's only right to be helping kids who were once like her. She's great at her job and is currently handling an abusive family with a violent father. Despite being swamped with work, her boss, Wayne, hands Emily her 39th case, the Sullivan family. Later that night, Emily meets up with her psychologist friend, Doug, for a drink. They order drinks and talk about Emily's job, implying that she's a workaholic. Drunk on cocktails, Doug suggests having a purely physical relationship, no strings attached. She only kisses him on the cheek as an answer. When she gets home, she opens up the Sullivan case file and learns about the parents, Edward and Margaret, and their daughter, Lilith. The case file states that Lilith has not been performing well at school and hasn't eaten anything in weeks. This prompts Emily to pay them a visit. When she arrives, she notices the rundown state of the house and the bars on the windows. She meets Lilith, who seems like a scared and troubled child. As they sit in the living room, Emily asks if Edward can join them. Margaret says that he's not at home, but an electrical whirring sound coming from the basement proves she's lying. Left with no choice, she persuades her husband to join their talk. Edward refuses to talk to Emily directly and instead dictates what his wife is saying. Emily explains the conditions to them and notes how absurd the whole situation is. When she checks in at work, she tells Wayne about the Sullivan family. Unfortunately, if there's no evidence of abuse, they can't bring the child in, but Wayne compromises and agrees to meet with the Sullivans. The next day, Emily is surprised to see the family dressed up, almost as if they're picture perfect. After a quick interrogation, Wayne tells her that they can't do anything else if there's no evidence of abuse. She comes up with an idea and talks to Lilith separately. She quickly gains a good rapport with Lilith and asks her what's wrong. With tears in her eyes, Lilith tells her that her parents are planning on sending her to hell. She brings her to Wayne, but Lilith instantly clams up. Left with no choice, Emily visits her friend, Detective Mike Barron, for help. Mike is hesitant to help but instructs her to gather evidence. Later that night, Lilith watches in terror as her father drills a hole on the ground of their cellar. Emily decides to pay Lilith a visit at her school and hands the child her number and tells her to call her if anything happens. When she gets home from work, she receives a call. It's Lilith and she's scared. She tells Emily that she can hear her parents waiting outside her room. She apologizes to Emily and starts falling asleep. Emily then calls Mike and runs to her car. Meanwhile, Lilith is asleep under her bed. They carry her downstairs and place her into the oven. Lilith wakes up and tries to escape, but her father pins her down as her mother slaps duct tape onto her face. They drag her back in, tape the oven door, and turn on the gas. Emily and Mike hear her screams as they break down the door. Emily arrives at the kitchen and pushes Margaret aside, forcing the oven door open. Mike follows her with his gun out but is tackled by Edward. He fights back and smashes the father into the fridge. As Emily applies first aid, Margaret comes up behind her with a knife. Mike quickly intervenes and takes her down. They arrive just in time and save Lilith. After the arrest, the parents are ordered to go under psychiatric evaluation to see if they're fit for trial. The outcome disappoints Emily, who thinks they should go straight to jail. Later that day, she visits Lilith at the hospital, who is under Doug's care. Lilith begs her if she can go live with her instead of a state home, but Emily hesitates, thinking that she's not mother material. However, her fondness for Lilith wins her over and she manages to convince the court to grant her custody of the child. Emily takes Lilith home and takes her on a tour of the house. She gives her chamomile tea and tucks her in at night in her own bedroom. The next day, Emily visits the empty Sullivan house to get a few of Lilith's belongings. She enters the master bedroom and notices the scuff marks on the floor and the multiple locks, implying that Lilith's parents must have barricaded themselves inside their room every night. Meanwhile, Lilith attends group therapy with another kid from one of Emily's cases, Diego. The next day, after dropping Lilith off school, Wayne asks for her. She learns that over the night, Diego killed his parents. Emily goes immediately to the scene of the crime and meets up with Mike. He tells her the gruesome details of the slaughter, how Diego had taken a tire iron from the garage and had smashed his parents to death while they slept. Emily refuses that Diego was capable of murder and sees him at a juvenile facility. He breaks down and admits to killing his parents. Emily then hangs out with Lilith at a beach and they talk about her neglected past. The next morning, Emily catches Lilith going through her stuff, curious about what Emily's family is like. Lilith learns that Emily's mother died from an accident because she was driving too fast on a rainy day. Later that day, Emily meets up with Mike for lunch. He tells her that a call came from Emily's house the night before the murders. She strongly denies making the call, and the detective decides to interrogate Lilith. Despite his probing, the girl denies the call. As Mike leaves, he tells Emily that he doesn't believe Lilith. Emily investigates further and talks to Diego again. She asks him about the phone call, but he has a panic attack before he can answer. At the infirmary, Diego admits it was Lilith who made the call with the voice of a man. As they wait for Lilith's evaluation, Emily's suspicions about her grow. She feels a deep pit in her stomach that something is wrong with the child. Doug arrives and talks to Lilith alone. Suddenly, Lilith's personality changes, she shows her true colors, and she turns around the conversation. She isn't an innocent little girl like everyone thinks she is, instead, she's a more sinister entity. She criticizes Doug and subtly threatens him. The evaluation ends and Doug tells Emily that he has never spoken with a child like that before. This alarms her and feeds her fears even more. When Doug gets home, he receives a call but thinks it's the wrong number. As he studies Lilith's case, a persistent buzzing in his ear stops him. He goes to his bathroom and takes out a hornet from his ear. More hornets appear on his shoulder and panic starts to rise from inside him. Soon enough, multiple hornets are flying inside the room and he desperately kills each one. The buzzing doesn't stop and a horde of hornets appear on his back. With trembling hands, he takes off his shirt, careful not to disturb the insects, and locks it in his shower. The buzzing is now in his head and more hornets start coming out of his eyes, ears, and mouth. He swats at them, screaming, breaking the shower door in the process, and ultimately slips back and hits his head on the toilet, ensuring his death. After Doug's funeral, a permanent cold has wedged itself between them, and Lilith senses this. Emily seeks Mike's advice and shares her theory that Lilith might have something to do with Doug's death and Diego's case. He dismisses her theory as grief and refuses to help. At the office, she steals the Sullivans' interview tapes and watches Margaret deny Lilith as her daughter and that the child has killed people before. As soon as Lilith was born, people who knew her just started dying. Intrigued by the interview, Emily visits Lilith's parents. With Margaret indisposed, she talks to Edward. As soon as she starts talking, he asks who died. He reveals that Lilith is a demon, feeding on a person's kind soul and that it was not an accident Emily found her. She wants to know what your idea of hell is and make you live there. Lilith has planned everything from the start and plans to bleed Emily dry until she's done with her and moves on to the next family. Back at home, Emily gets rid of all the dangerous materials in her house but keeps one knife for herself, just in case. When Lilith gets home, she pretends as if there's nothing wrong. She asks Emily about her mother, sending her a subtle message that she knows what Emily's up to. The next day, Emily tries to get rid of her custody rights, but the system refuses, stating that it was her in the first place who fought for those rights and that they're still looking for a foster home for Lilith. When Emily meets Lilith after group therapy, she spots her whispering to another kid. She feels alarmed and drags her out of the room. The staff reprimands her and tells her not to do it again while Lilith feigns innocence. As they stand in the elevator, the pretenses are now gone. Lilith berates Emily, provoking her as much as she can, but Emily doesn't give in. Suddenly the elevator stops working and the cables break, sending them down at a fatal speed. Emily grabs the handles, anticipating death, but is surprised to see that they have landed safely on the first floor. She seeks out Mike and asks for her help again, more convinced this time that Lilith is a demon. Mike gets mad at her and tells her to seek help or else he's going to report her. Things get worse for Emily at work as she starts experiencing hallucinations. When she gets home that night, she ignores Lilith and barricades herself in her bedroom. Lilith starts banging at her door, demanding her to let her in. Emily grabs a weapon and screams at her to leave her alone, and the knocking suddenly stops. She hears a noise coming from her closet and finds a burned woman. The woman lunges at her but she manages to run outside. Desperate for help, she spots a bus and demands the driver to let her in. The doors open and she gets inside the bus. The driver tells her that there's nobody out there. When Emily looks out the window, the woman is gone. She gets into her car, planning to escape, but is shocked to see Lilith already there. Lilith threatens her, saying that Emily will do whatever she wants or else. The next morning, Emily is informed that the system finally found a home for Lilith. Knowing Lilith's true nature, she knows that this family will die. She talks to Edward again and he tells her that if Lilith moves, the whole thing will start all over again. The only way to stop the cycle is to kill her in her sleep. The next day, Margaret wakes up in her room which has now turned into an oven. She runs around, trying to escape, but her body catches on fire. The nurse checks up on her and it's revealed that she's having hallucinations. Just then, Edward sits across a man at the cafeteria who starts speaking in Lilith's voice. He jumps at the man and stabs his neck with a fork. The police try to take him down, but he accidentally stabs himself in the eye. Meanwhile, Emily meets up with Mike again, who has something important to tell her. He has discovered evidence that Lilith did in fact call Doug the night of his death. She then tells Mike that they have to stop her, and he finally agrees. Mike gears up and grabs a shotgun as Emily goes home and plans to sedate Lilith. When she arrives, she finds her house in a disarray. Meanwhile, Mike is haunted by a pack of dogs in the parking lot. He escapes to his car but finds one of the dogs already there with him. He frantically loads his shotgun as the dog lunges at him. He pulls the trigger and ends up blowing his head off. Emily finds her case files all over the floor and pictures of Diego, Doug, and Mike, confirming her worst fears, that Lilith is after them. She goes to Lilith's bedroom and looks for the buzzing sound when Wayne calls her, confirming that Mike is dead and has shot himself in the head. She breaks down crying and scared, knowing that she'll have to do this alone. Music starts blaring from the living room and she marches out, throwing the television on the floor and slapping Lilith's bowl of popcorn away, screaming at her to get out of the house. Lilith screams back at her, revealing her deep voice and distorted face. Emily runs away to her bedroom, terrified, and starts barricading the door. Lilith arrives at the door and pretends to apologize, tempting her to open the door. Suddenly, the door starts banging. The hinges are thrown off the floor, the walls start to crack, and the door is busted open. She hides under the bed as Lilith enters the room. She eventually finds her and Emily pretends to promise that she will love her. Satisfied, Lilith leaves her alone and asks her to tuck her in. Emily mixes sedatives into Lilith's tea and urges her to take it. Once she's asleep, she grabs a can of gas and starts dousing the house. She sets everything on fire, grabs her fish, and goes outside, watching the house burn. The firefighters arrive and Emily is shocked to see Lilith among them, unharmed and alive. The police take them and help them find a place to stay. As they follow the police car, Emily takes a different route. Lilith begins taunting her, revealing that Emily's mother didn't die of an accident, but of suicide. That's why Emily's afraid of having children, afraid of becoming like her mother. Emily feels nothing but hatred now as she speeds up her driving. She starts hallucinating and sees herself as her mother, driving on the day that she died. She sees herself in the backseat as a child, asking her to slow down. As she looks out at the road, she sees a truck coming towards them. Emily screams that it's not real and braces herself for impact. She drives through the illusion and sees a terrified Lilith beside her. She feels more courage now and isn't afraid of her anymore. Emily drives through the gates and straight to the docks, launching the car straight into the water. She tries to drown Lilith, sticking her into the trunk through the backseat. Lilith has now transformed into her final form, a decaying demon with razor-sharp fingers. Emily struggles as the water fills up the car, but she's finally able to lock the demon in. She escapes through the passenger door and swims up when Lilith's hand breaks through the taillight and grabs her legs. She pushes upward, grasping at the water, and kicks herself free off her grasp. She reaches the water's surface and takes a deep breath. She hauls herself out of the water and sits at the dock, looking at the sunrise, finally found a home for Lilith. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.